We're looking at the book of Revelation, and in the first lecture we talked about the sort of an overview of the book, but talked primarily about the genre of the book and interpreting the symbolism of the book. In this lecture, I want to look at different interpretive approaches that have been used with respect to the book of Revelation, and also take a look at the situation of the church in the first century and the purposes and themes of the book. Now, important questions dealing with how to interpret the book of Revelation are such things as to what extent is the book related to the first century when it was written and the circumstances of the church in the first century, and to what extent does the book relate to the period just before Jesus comes again. Furthermore, to what extent is the book transhistorical or principiant? In other words, dealing with principles that apply throughout history without specifically referring to any particular historical events. Now, different answers to those questions have led to 5 main interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation. The first is what's known as the preterist approach, and the preterist approach contends that the book relates to the events of the first century, and that John is telling how the churches should cope with the oppression taking place in the first century and how God would deal with their oppressors. Now, there are 2 variants to the preterist approach. The primary preterist position basically says that the book of Revelation is a prophecy of the outpouring of God's wrath on Jerusalem, and that all of the events, the last days, the generations, etc., all are pointing to the events that find their fulfillment in AD 70, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman Empire. Now, the second form of the preterist approach holds that Revelation is a prophecy of the triumph of the church over its enemies, namely triumph over unbelieving Israel and triumph over the Roman Empire, and so that it finds its fulfillment not in AD 70, but when Rome officially became a Christian empire. Now, the strengths of the preterist approach, basically, the greatest strength is dealing with the historical setting in which John wrote, and the 7 churches to which he wrote, and also the time references at the end of the book, which essentially say this will happen soon. Now, there are a number of weaknesses of the preterist approach. First, when the book was written, the preterist version, which sees Revelation as being fulfilled in AD 70, of course, must assume that the book was written before AD 70, and strong arguments have been made for that position. Nevertheless, based both on internal and external evidence, the majority of scholars contend that the book was written probably around the year AD 95 during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. So if that is true, then the primary preterist approach is invalid per se. Also, the time references. Now, beginning in Revelation 1, verse 1, where it talks about the things which must soon take place, and other references throughout the book which talk about the soon fulfillment, these are derived, as I mentioned in another context in the first lecture, from the book of Daniel, because in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel talks about things that will happen in the latter days. But in Revelation 1, verse 1, John substitutes the word soon or quickly for Daniel's in the latter days. Now, when John says soon or quickly in Revelation 1, verse 1, that does not connote either the speedy manner in which Daniel's prophecy is to be fulfilled, or the fact that it will be consummated soon or quickly. Rather, it implies the idea that the final tribulation, the defeat of evil, and the establishment of the kingdom, which Daniel expected to occur in the distant future, in the latter days, would begin now. John is saying these things will begin in his generation, and indeed that has already begun to happen. But that does not imply that these things will be consummated in his generation. What John is saying is that in principle, Satan has been defeated. The kingdom is present now. And after all, you may recall Jesus said, when I do these things, cast out the demons, heal, and so on, the kingdom of God is in your midst. The kingdom of God has come upon you. So Jesus inaugurated the kingdom in the first coming. And so what John is saying here, that he's writing about things which must soon take place, or take place quickly, that is consistent with what is known as the already but the not yet of the kingdom. Namely that the kingdom has already been inaugurated, but it has not yet been consummated. The inauguration of the kingdom, the powers of the kingdom, came with the first coming of Christ in the first century, but they will find their consummation at the second coming of Christ. And so even the time references are consistent with principles that began in the first century, but are going to continue throughout all of history until Christ comes again. Furthermore, the preterist position, I think, is deficient in that it seriously downplays the eschatological and universal aspects of the book of Revelation. And so we mentioned in the first lecture that the description of the beasts largely comes from Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. He's describing world empires, not just the Roman Empire as it existed in John's day. And both Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and in Revelation, it contemplates universal judgment, not just local judgment. Yes, in AD 70, of course, Jerusalem was destroyed, but the entire world was not. And so, as I see it, when Revelation, for example, Revelation 1 verse 7, it talks about that when Christ comes, all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Now, to limit that, as the preterists do, to the tribes of the land, namely of Israel, when Christ brought judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70, is to obscure the universal aspect of the judgment that Revelation is really talking about, because the mourners are not going to include only Israel, but they're going to include the Gentile nations as well. And so when Revelation later refers to every tribe, which is similar to all the tribes, in Revelation 1 verse 7, it talks about all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Later on, it talks about, in Revelation 5 verse 9 and 7 verse 9, that the church consists of people from every tribe, tongue, nation, and people in the entire world. So Revelation is contemplating universal principles, not merely local and temporal principles. And we see this again and again in Revelation 3. It talks about the hour of testing that's going to come upon the entire world. We talked about how Babylon the Great is described as ruling over all of the kings of the world. And so I think preterism, while it emphasizes what was going on in the first century, it misses the universal scope of Revelation. It misses the universal scope of the judgment, and God's universal plan to restore and renew creation to a state of perfect righteousness. Now, another interpretive approach is what's known as the historicist approach. And this views Revelation as a symbolic prophecy of the entire history of the church, from its beginning to when Christ comes again. But so what most historicists, and this view was popular particularly in the 19th century, view the seven letters to the seven churches as looking at the church over time. For example, the church at Ephesus, the first church described in Revelation 2, is epitomizing the early church until the death of John. Then Smyrna represents the church from the 2nd to the 4th centuries. Pergamum, the beginning of the church-state system under Constantine. Thyatira representing the Roman Catholic Church. Sardis representing the Protestant Reformation. Philadelphia, the faithful church in the last days. And Laodicea, the apostate church in the last days. Now, this historicist approach is strong in that it takes seriously the fact that Revelation is applicable and relevant to all periods of church history until Christ comes again. But it has severe weaknesses because historicists tend to view the literary order of the visions in Revelation as the chronological order in which the events will take place in history, and that view is simply false. Furthermore, there are no fixed guidelines to determine which historical events are meant. And so historicists, contradict each other as to which church represents which period of time. And historicism also tends to define historical movements too specifically, and most all historicists limit their views to the history of the Western church. They take no account of the church in Africa, the church in Asia, the church elsewhere in the world. And historicists always seem to discover the climax of prophecy as occurring in their own day, which is always a sure sign that that approach is wrong. Now, a third major view is the futurist approach, which essentially views Revelation 4 verse 1 through 22 verse 5 as depicting the so-called tribulation period and its aftermath. In other words, a future period of years. Most futurists view the tribulation as consisting of 7 years, a false view which we discuss in detail in our book on biblical eschatology. But namely, that the book of Revelation is dealing with the period of time just before Jesus comes again. Now, the great strength of this view is that it does recognize that Revelation does deal with events just before and at the time of and immediately after Christ's return to the earth. But the weaknesses of this view is, again, most futurists tend to view the order of the visions in Revelation as corresponding to the chronological order in which these things take place in history. And as we will discuss later on, that is not true. Also, the futurist vision renders almost the entire book of Revelation irrelevant to the church because they view, most futurists view the church being raptured out of the world as of Revelation 4 verse 1 and not appearing again until the end of the book. And so, but, the entire book of Revelation, therefore, is irrelevant for the church in the first century, for the church, for the last 2,000 years, and it's irrelevant to us today until the so-called tribulation at the end of history occurs. It just seems to me any book which is irrelevant to the church for the last 2,000 years cannot possibly be correct. And also, it overlooks the fact that of the nearness of the events, because as we mentioned in connection with the preterist view, these events are happening soon. They are inaugurated soon. They are principles that began in the first century and are continuing to this day. So that the book of Revelation is very relevant to today, but the futurist view totally disregards that. And most futurists tend to be very speculative about the meaning of the visions in Revelation. They tend to take things very literally, which, for the reasons we discussed in the first lecture, is also false. Now, Contrary to the futurist view, there is another view is called the idealist view. Now, historicism and futurism tend towards very specific identification of Revelation's passages and meaning, and so does preterism. Preterism located the entire book basically in the first century. Historicism and futurism tend to be very specific in their identification of what's going on. Idealism is kind of the opposite of that. The idealist view tends to view Revelation as looking at the forces of good versus evil, the kingdom of God versus the powers of Satan. And most pure idealists tend to not identify any of the images or visions or symbols with any specific events, either in the present, the past, or in the future. Now, this view has important strengths. Idealism correctly recognizes that theology and symbolism are central to the book of Revelation, and it sees the book as dealing with issues and principles that are relevant throughout the entire life of the church. A major weakness in the idealist view, however, is that it refuses to see any of the prophecies of the book as dealing with history, either past, present, or future, although the book appears to deal with specific events from time to time. And therefore, in its purest form, idealism simply looks at the book as dealing with the timeless struggle between good and evil, God and Satan. And therefore, pure idealism does not show or depict any final consummation of history, whereas I think it's pretty clear that in the book of Revelation, God is showing us his final victory. And so that leads to the fifth approach, the one that we adopt here, what I call the eclectic approach. We try to take the best aspects of the other four approaches, namely preterism, historicism, futurism, and idealism, but realize that the book does deal with events of the first century. It does deal with events of the future. It does deal with general principles that apply across the board. And I think we see that in that John's visions, as we mentioned, are drawn both from the Old Testament and from Greco-Roman culture. And so there are things, for example, in talking about Mystery Babylon and the beast and so on, that are clearly drawn from the Roman Empire. And yet, the way he has worded these things, his symbolism is flexible enough that they're not limited to events involving the Roman Empire, but apply generally to any anti-Christian society, empire, culture, throughout time and place. And so we see, and as I mentioned, John often will begin with the specific, but then generalize things. So he talks about how, for example, Babylon, it's a great harlot. It sits upon many waters, but then he defines this as the waters are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So he's using a specific example, but applying this to all kinds of people throughout the world. So the themes and imagery of Revelation are not merely references to particular events. Yes, they were based on events from the Old Testament and events in John's day, but they have ongoing relevance for the church throughout history. And therefore, I think the principles of eclecticism, trying to draw the best of the other approaches, is, I think, the most accurate way of viewing the book of Revelation. So with that said, let's take a brief look at the situation of the church in the first century, because what Revelation reveals to us is that it reflects conflict among Christians, conflict between Christians and Jews, and conflict between Christians and the Roman Empire. And so the book attempts to interpret these conflicts and resolve them according to its own perspective. So we take a look, for example, the kingdom and culture. Now, Revelation raises the issue that's relevant to Christians in all times and places, and namely, why, since God is sovereign and Christ has already inaugurated his kingdom, is the culture so pagan, and why do we suffer? And because that was happening in John's day, and it's happened in all times and places to varying degrees for the last 2,000 years all over the world. So in Roman society, there was the rise of the cult of the emperor, and Christians were supposed to bow down to the emperor. Christians didn't do that, and that got them landed in prison and thrown to the lions in the arena. The trade guilds had their own gods, and Christians, as good citizens, were supposed to go to the suppers and the dinners for the trade guilds and pay homage to the gods. Christians did not go along with that. And so they were viewed as not being good citizens. We face the same kind of issues today. Maybe not in the same form, but the issue is, how much are we going to bow down to the dominant culture? How much are we going to bow down to the culture's gods? Now, we might not bow down to physical statues like in that day, but to the god of money, to the god of power, to the god of success, and so on and so forth, to going along and getting along. These are the issues that John uses the symbolism of the events of his day, but what I'm pointing out is these same principles, these same issues face us today, no matter where we live. Furthermore, there was conflict between Christians and Jews. Before AD 70, most Romans viewed Christians as simply a sect of Judaism, but the Christians did not support the rebellion that was led during the Jewish War of AD 68 to 70, and as a result, Christianity became divorced from Judaism. Why is that important? That's important because all the other religions were basically limited to where they came from, but the Jews sort of had special dispensation. They could worship their God in any place in the Roman Empire, not limited just to the land of Israel. But now the Christians no longer had that benefit, and that got them in trouble not only with the Jews, but also with the Romans. And so there's the issue of the kingdom and the culture. There's also the issue of persecution. Now, the church suffered, and we see this in Revelation 2 and 3 and elsewhere, sporadic persecutions from the beginning. But by the time the book of Revelation was written, there had been no empire-wide. There had been persecution in Rome itself, but there had been no empire-wide systematic persecution of the church. But we see from what John is saying here, I think John is probably foreseeing the existing trends in society that would lead to increased persecution in the future. And therefore, the book of Revelation is replete with examples that warn believers of coming persecution and exhort them to be faithful all the way to the end, to be faithful witnesses. And again, we see the same kind of thing wherever we are. In some societies, much greater, some societies less. But there's always this threat, and things can change in a heartbeat. So Revelation is relevant to us when we deal with the issue of persecution. And further, another important issue in Revelation is the internal problems of the churches. Now, the letters to the 7 churches reveal that there were problems in the churches. And those problems included lack of love, and we see this in Revelation 2 and 3 very clearly. Lack of love, false teaching in the churches, immorality based on false teaching, false prophecy, spiritual deadness, lack of faithfulness, lack of perseverance, and lukewarmness and pride. All of these things have been present for the last 2,000 years in various churches and denominations and are present today. So Revelation is relevant to the church because it is dealing with the issues that have affected and continue to affect the church throughout history in every time and place. So let me conclude then this lecture with looking at basic purposes and themes of the book. And let me just cite three that I think go throughout the entire book. The first is, Revelation helps to explain to the church how God is dealing with the world. Now, one writer has pointed out that many scenes in the book are located in heaven, and then we see judgments happening on the earth. And the scenes in heaven precede the events that happen on the earth to which they are attached. What does this tell us? This tells us that what is going to take place on the earth, even though it's unknown to us and unexpected by us, is fully known to those in heaven, to the ascended Lord, to the angels, and so on and so forth. And what is taking place on the earth is under the complete control and direction of heaven. And so Revelation is explaining to us how God is dealing with the world. And so, we can look at what's happening in the world. There are good things and there are bad things. And if we just focus on the earthly dimension, we can get very depressed. But what Revelation is telling us, there is a different view. There is God's view, a God's eye view of what is happening on the earth. And if we keep that in mind, we realize everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, are all a part of God's plan. And that can give us confidence and keep us faithful. Secondly, and related to this, Revelation is a call for us, the church, to persevere in the struggle with the powers of evil. Because, again, different cultures, they're good or bad to one degree or another. But, you see, the life of the church is very much like the life of Jesus. Jesus, our King, he conquered, not with the sword, but he conquered by maintaining a faithful witness all the way to the end. And he overcame the powers of evil. We are called to persevere in doing the same. Maintain a faithful witness all the way to the end, even if it means our death. You see, because in dying faithfully, Jesus actually triumphed. He triumphed over Satan. He triumphed over evil. He triumphed over death. And that is what we will do if we persevere. And Revelation, in symbol after symbol, is telling us to do exactly that. And finally, Revelation is written to comfort us and to encourage us. Why? Because Christ is victor. God knows the end from the beginning. And in Revelation, he tells us the end from the beginning. That's why Revelation concludes with the final judgment in chapter 20, and then with the new heavens and the new earth in chapters 21 and 22, at which time all evil, all suffering, all sin, and all death will be abolished forever. And so Revelation is revealing to us a God of love and power who triumphs sovereignly over all of his enemies. And human history will culminate when Satan himself suffers eternal defeat and the bridegroom embraces the bride. Further, as we go through the book of Revelation, it tells us and it shows us in various places that God hears our prayers. He answers our prayers. He is sovereign, and we are playing a part in bringing about the consummation of the kingdom. So this book has important themes that relate directly to us. They've related to the church throughout history, and these themes should encourage us, should explain what God is doing, and they call us to a life of perseverance and faith, and they show us that our faith is not in vain because Jesus is the victor. So, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the structure of the book of Revelation, and as we see the structure, that will help us to understand this book much better.